Now, it is popular to oppose this gender identity system with, say, a biological or a scientific description of gender. And we don't really need to go far beyond like dumb comment sections to see this, right? Someone says, well, I've known that I'm a male since I was young, and then, Truth Bomber 93 says all men have penises, and that's kind of the level of discourse that we're at. Fine. And the differences between those views are apparent, right? One uses biology, science, and the other uses a psychological sense of their own being, and the two come into conflict. I'm not denying the differences, but I think there's actually a common assumption to both methods of determining the truth about gender. Both believe that gender is a fact about the human person that results from non-gendered parts and can be deduced from them. What I mean is this. The biological argument says, I can prove that you're female by looking at, say, your DNA. If you have two of the same sex chromosomes, XX, then you are female, right? QED. Now, this argument, while it sounds at first to have a kind of strength to it, right, because we live in a scientific age and any kind of appeal to science immediately is invested with power, this argument actually appears to be a little weaker once you scratch at it. So say we ask something like, yeah, but how do you know having two of the same sex chromosomes is a property of being female, right? Much less a property of being a woman. Inevitably, the answer is something like, well, in investigating all of those people, creatures, things that we call female, we found that they all had two of the same sex chromosomes. So it's a bit of a shell game, right? We already had to have the concept of female in order to say something like all women have two of the same sex chromosomes. And I'm not even considering intersex conditions right now in which people can anatomically appear to be what we would call a woman while actually having different sex chromosomal patterns. I'm merely speaking of the fact that in order to know that sex chromosomes are significant, that they mean being female, that they mean being a woman in some way, we have to already have the conception that beings in the world are women and are female in order to investigate them and find out what are their sex chromosomes, right? Obviously, we know that knowing about DNA is not how we've come to know about gender. If it was, we would only have figured out the man and woman thing in the last 50 years. One way to conceptualize this, because I think it does require a kind of moving past what we think of as science and realizing how science is often very informed by the meanings that we bring to it. One way that I like to conceptualize this is like, imagine an island of only men. And I don't mean like all men move to an island. I mean this island has never included even the idea of women. It's simply what we would call male beings. Now, say that on this island, some enterprising researchers started to do DNA tests, and they found that of all of these men, some, in fact, had XX chromosomes and some had XY chromosomes. Now, in this instance, would our scientists be able to derive from their experiments that there was a fundamental difference between the men of this island? That in fact, we could say that there were male and females rather than it being, in fact, an island of only men? I think it's obvious that the answer is no. They wouldn't be able to derive that unless they were already investigating what they thought to be someone different. It'd be more like finding a variation within the same, say that some men are bald or that some men are tall. We already know that there's many chromosomal differences that don't indicate some kind of difference in being. I mean, think of something like having Down syndrome. But we don't look at these chromosomal differences and say, aha, and therefore this means you are a categorically different kind of person than everyone else. Rather, we say this is a modification in some way of the human experience. So it's not sufficient, is what I'm saying, to look at DNA, to look even at anatomy and simply say this means that you're a woman. This means that you're a man. What the biological argument takes for as proof for one's being a woman relies on us already understanding certain people as being women in order to become proof. Only a prior knowledge of gender allows us to turn a material variation into a fact that signifies a truth about the whole human person. To put this all very simply, this is simply to say that the meaning of the data we investigate can often depend on the anthropology or the theory of the human person that we bring to bear on the data. What the biological argument cannot justify on its own is the leap made from this analysis of parts to a description of the whole human person, that global sense of gender that we talked about. This is obvious in that we could continue to describe the person in question not with that noun, man, woman, but with an increasing number of adjectives, the more and more biological data that we accumulate. So, for instance, I could say this is a human being, right, which is a genderless word. It's a human being with 2 of the same sex chromosomes, with a womb, with a menstrual cycle, with an experience that they call femininity, right? I could add all of these adjectives to the human person and say, look, this person has all of these things, these parts, these experiences. But at no point am I justified in moving from an increasing number of adjectives to a noun, right? At no point can I justify saying, okay, I'm describing this human being, but now I know that this human being is in fact this thing we call gender, this different thing, this other substantial thing that describes the whole of them, not just their attributes. Now, this is usually where what I would call a nominalist argument picks up. And it says quite simply that woman is just the word we give for human beings that have all those attributes, just like man is a word we give for a human being that has male sex attributes, right? And that's fine. And frankly, that's an airtight argument, right? But it's dissatisfying, I think, and a little boring, because it ends up where Judith Butler and queer theorists and thinkers of that field begin, namely that there's no substantive thing called gender, there's no substantive men or women. All we have is material variation and traits, and then we ascribe to that a kind of linguistic construction. Like we culturally, socially, and even individually agree that that's what these material traits mean, so we give it this name, right? The problem with that is that it becomes a contingent reality, by which I simply mean that we could have had it otherwise. We could have named those traits otherwise. We could have included some and left others out and said, no, that's a man or that's a woman. It indicates nothing of the truth beyond our own language. It doesn't satisfy the question, what is gender? How do I know if I'm a man or a woman? Beyond saying that we all agree to call certain things by a certain name. And that's why I say that this argument is dissatisfying, even while it has a kind of airtightness when considered in itself. By scratching at gender, we've opened up all of metaphysics, right? Nominalism, realism, these kind of words about how we view the nature of reality immediately start to bubble up into our discussion. But all I want to argue here is that the biological argument and the gender identity system, which are usually opposed to each other, or at least held by people that are saying that they're opposed to each other, that these in fact have the same structural argument. That argument is that gender is something that is the result of non-gendered parts, right? So my being a man is a result of these chromosomal bodily variations, right? Or on the gender identity side, that my being a man is a result, it happens due to these psychological experiences I have in combination with some kind of social event, right? So right from the get-go, both of them see gender as something that is, as it were, reducible into non-gendered parts. It doesn't see gender as something that is concomitant with the human person, such that we could say something like the human person is male and female, that the human person is, in fact, a twofold reality, that we are social in our gender at our core of our being. We wouldn't be able to say any of these kinds of things because what we're really saying is gender is the result of a process. It's a result of parts. Okay, so the gender identity system, for its part, attempts to derive gender from the human person in the same way, from non-gendered parts. So in fact, I would say the gender identity argument or theory is actually the biological scientific argument. It's just that it's psychologized. So whereas the scientific argument looks to genetics, to anatomy, we're still looking to some fact that results in gender, right? Or that gender can be deduced from. But now what we're looking is into the psychology of the human person, like their sense of self. So it's the same structural argument, but different things provide the trump card. Different things are the proof of one's gender. So where the naive sort of biological argument says if you have a penis, then you're a man, the gender identity argument says something like if you have the felt sense of being a man, you're a cisgender or transgender man, depending on how that relates to your sex assigned at birth. But obviously, this gender identity, this part, this psychological act that is supposed to result in the gender of the person already relies on and is already informed by a conception of gender, right? The felt sense of being a woman, which is the language that we all use to describe gender identity, right? It's my felt sense of being this or that. Well, this felt sense includes woman in its definition, in much the same way that female sex chromosomes include female in their definition. Both seem to be the thing that makes one a woman, but on closer investigation, the only reason they have that status of a causal factor or of proof is because, in fact, we already think of them as belonging to that thing out there in the world that we call woman. This becomes pretty clear once we investigate the actual content of the felt sense of being a woman, right? Not just anything can be taken as the felt sense of being a woman. So say, for instance, I sit in my room, I meditate, and I try to sense what is my sense of self, right? And what I find in there is a desire to make a lot of money and a kind of disdain for poor people, right? Now, would I be justified in saying that these senses of myself, of my interior state, are in fact the felt sense of being a woman? No, right? Obviously, that's an unjustifiable position. But what that means is that not just anything can be the felt sense of being a woman. Rather, that sense of self must be correlated with something. It's what philosophers like to call intentional. Every sensing is a sensing of something. So that felt sense must be correlated with something out there in the world, something we recognize as being a woman or female. So the system of gender identity is not the way the human person becomes this or that gender. Rather, it is parasitic on a view of the world that already includes gender. Again, we have to look at this a little more closely because I think it is confusing. Say I were to argue that I'm a liberal, right? Now, someone might ask, well, how do you know you're a liberal? How do you really know that? And what if I said something like this? Well, I have the felt sense of being a liberal. Now, that person might ask, oh, sure, but you haven't told me what that is, what a liberal is. What is the felt sense of being a liberal? Now, the way the gender identity argument works in this context is I would say something like, well, I have the felt sense of belonging to this social category that I call liberals, right? I belong to this group. They might then ask, okay, fine, you belong to a social group called liberals, but what makes up this social group of which you are a part? And at this point, I could answer, well, I've already answered you. The social category is made up of all those people with the felt sense of being a liberal. Now, you can already see where this argument starts to dissatisfy. It starts to itch against our own intellect. Because obviously, the problem is that the word liberal here has no content. It's a meaningless word. In this way of arguing, it's utterly irrelevant that a liberal be a certain person with certain political beliefs, right? We could replace liberal with the letter X, and we'd still be correct. Why? Well, because the argument is a structural argument. It hinges on a tautology, really. So I could say, what it means to be an X is to feel that one belongs to the social category X, and social category X is constituted by all those people who feel that they belong to social category X, right? At no point do you need to care about what this X is. Thus, to avoid simply being a tautology, the gender identity system feeds upon the system that it claims to replace, right? So it needs people who belong to the social category, say, woman, not because they feel themselves to belong to that social category, right? But because they are women or believe themselves to be women in some substantive sense, right? That they are women as a matter of their creation, of their essence. It's who, in fact, they are. So the actual situation that results from our gender identity system is that some women provide the actual content, the actual meaning of the word woman by being, or at least claiming to be women, an objective, knowable, bodily, and spiritual reality. And this allows all others who would self-identify as a woman to do so in a purely structural manner, arguing, in effect, that they belong to that category over there. They identify as one of those beings that we all know. Now, this is obviously a huge irony, because the whole point of the system of gender identity is that it's supposed to get rid of any hierarchy between different genders, right? It allows people to speak of gender without giving priority to any single group of people, most notably cisgender or non-transgender people, right? These cisgender and non-transgender people are no longer defined as the natural or the proper articulation of man and woman or anything like that. They occupy one position among many. Sure, you're cisgender. That means that you're a kind of being whose gender identity happens to match the sex that you were assigned at birth, right? Now, you could be otherwise. You could be someone whose gender identity doesn't match their sex assigned at birth, right? You could be within degrees of that non-correspondence, right? The point is that gender identity was supposed to relativize, gender, to take away a hierarchy. But what it's actually done, what actually occurs in this system of gender identity, is that those who understand gender to be who they are, without recourse to this psychological felt sense or an act of self-identification that means you belong to the social category of woman or man or whatever it is, that these people are not simply given the privilege and priority that they've been historically given, right? They actually become necessary to the existence of all other genders. So only because there are already women and men can there be a system of determining gender by sensing oneself or not sensing oneself or partially sensing oneself as a woman or a man. This actually heightens the hold that the naturally assumed male-female binary, the kind of binary that we often speak of as like the oppressive binary, it actually heightens the hold this has on all gender and gender expressions. Why? Well, because while a third gender or a queer gender or even transgender depends upon this intelligible male or female, man and woman in the world that they can refer to as giving the content to that felt sense of belonging to man, woman, right? While these genders depend on the male-female binary, it's not the case that the male-female binary, right, those who would claim themselves to be naturally man or woman, depend on these alternative genders for their intelligibility, right? They don't derive the intelligibility of saying I'm a man or I'm a woman by referencing third genders or being genderqueer or transgender, right? Rather, they are claiming that they have that quite on their own. So the result of the gender identity model is that all non-binary genders, right, broadly understood, are placed in a relationship of abject dependence to the very binary that they're supposed to be troubling, relativizing, superseding, or otherwise overcoming. It's not radical.